Now we apologize in advance because we can't cover all the modern decks as much as we would like to. We don't have 6 hours to do that, unfortunately. And they're all a lot of fun to talk about, honestly. They're all different and fun and cool. So we're going to cover a couple here that we think are going to get played this weekend. There's one for sure. Now, this is a weird thing that happened. At Grand Prix Las Vegas, going into that tournament, here's what everyone knew. At that modern GP that was Saturday, Sunday, everyone knew that all the best people were going to play Death Shadow. Grixis Death Shadow, copy-paste, best deck, not even arguable. And it did not top 8 that tournament, which is kind of wild when you had Owen Turtenwald and, excuse me, Joel Larson and I believe Pascal Maynard and just like the best people in the tournament all playing the deck and like BBD, none of them top 8. So now the question is all of a sudden like, is this deck the best deck still, Craig? Or is this a little overhyped because we just covered 2 modern tournaments and Brad won one with Death Shadow. And then we had another one that was not won by Death Shadow, so is it the best deck?
It is still the best deck. I think you can say that.
Okay.
You know, we were in Baltimore and we were talking about how open the format was and how that was kind of frustrating for a lot of players. And then we were in Charlotte after that and we were talking about how the format was still open, but it was starting to consolidate a little bit. And I think Vegas is when you finally see what the metagame actually looks like. For a long time we had been talking about how some of these other fringe decks, Affinity, we had mentioned Affinity several times as a contender for a breakout. And then you go to Vegas a week later after we had just talked about it over the weekend.
Wins the tournament.
Wins the tournament, some others in the top 8, just a huge splash. So I think we're starting to see people understand the Death Shadow decks and gun for them.
It can be gunned for. I think it makes for a very good best deck in the format, but it can be beat, Matthias. Would you agree?
I'm not even sure. Death Shadow's a great deck right now. And you go back to Las Vegas, Monty's winning deck list was Affinity. There was no Shadow in the top 8. But let's look more at the statistics on this. When you start going down the deck list in top 32, then Death Shadow, it gets its numbers, and it still may be the best deck here. When I'm looking at modern matches, both playing them and watching them here from the booth, it feels like the Death Shadow decks, whether they're Jund, 4-color, Grixis, are just one step above everything that's not playing the card.
Now I know one of the opens earlier this year, Ryan, you were kind of playing a Grixis deck with Street Wraiths and Thought Scours and stuff. But I don't remember if you had Death Shadows in them, but you were kind of dabbling in that area. So I know that you were kind of one of the first people to realize that this is the thing you could be doing. It has evolved into a deck that a lot of people like to play. Talking with Torture Amonkhet champion Jerry Thompson, Jerry said he was kind of coming this term because he really wanted to play Death Shadow in Modern again before it gets banned. You know, are we looking at that powerful of a deck here?
If trends continue as they were before Grand Prix Las Vegas, of course Las Vegas was a data point that is a strike against banning Death Shadow. It suggests that the card is fine in the format. I think that actually long term, people talk about when you have a best deck, they say people aren't really tuning to beat the deck, and honestly I think that the Death Shadow deck isn't at its peak yet. Okay. I think that people are playing a list that is maybe slightly outdated. A list that I actually really like, if you look at our team open from Louisville, Clay Spickelmeyer's winning list. He won the Open with Chris Anderson and Spencer Garnier. He was playing Jund, Splashing, Stubborn Denial, and that deck felt very powerful. Honestly, when I play the current build of Grixis Shadow, I feel like Street Wraith is an obligation. You have some draws where it's incoherent with your game plan. The Jund deck, it's a privilege. You always want to draw Street Wraith. So honestly, I feel like there's a lot more to explore within the Death Shadow archetype itself.
There's a lot going on with that deck. There's a lot of moving parts, but here's what we can't argue. The power level deck's very high. Death Shadow is awesome in the deck. Tasigur on turn 2, Grim Egg Angler on turn 2, Kolaghan's Command, Stubborn Denial's a hard counter. I can't, Snapcaster Mage, can't forget about that obviously. Power level deck is extremely, extremely high. I expect once again for the best people to be playing that deck this weekend, but there are other options to go to, and we're going to go right to Affinity, because Manny Devuti did win Grand Prix Las Vegas with that deck, because for whatever reason, when you and I were covering Baltimore and Charlotte, this deck just wasn't really there.
No one wanted to play it.
And I don't know why, and I was thinking about that the whole time, like, I don't know why no one's playing this deck, but I feel like they should be, and then it just kind of, honestly, it creamed Vegas. Like, it's weird to say Affinity came from nowhere because it's been a deck since Modern started, Matthias, but it creamed Vegas.
You know, this is not the first time where we've seen Modern a spot where there's a deck on its own in Tier 1, we saw it with Eldrazi, and yet Affinity still hangs around just fine. And this isn't the first trophy. You know, you saw Monty Devuti getting a trophy with it in Las Vegas. You know, the team open in San Antonio had no Death Shadows on the winning team, but sure had an Affinity list in it. This is a really great deck. It's still definitely one of the decks you can play in Modern. I am a little concerned where Affinity is a deck that can sometimes be the victim of its own success because of how good the sideboard cards are against it. It did so well at Vegas.
Yeah.
And even the month before, that I'd be a little concerned about playing it this weekend. Especially if some Shadow players maybe go toward the Jund side of things, up their Ancient Grudge count. It might be a bad spot for Affinity, but otherwise a great deck to sleep up.
Yeah, when I played in Grand Prix Las Vegas, Ryan, the modern Grand Prix, I played Fairies, and I didn't really have a lot of hate for that deck. I mean, I played a main deck Go for the Throat. Not very good against Affinity.
Yeah, all right.
Really good at killing Tassiger, really good at killing Gurmag Angler. I was there to mainly beat the Shadow deck, so I thought the best people were going to play, and all of a sudden, and this isn't taking anything from Manny DeVoot or anything, but the best players in the room were all playing Shadow, none of them were playing Affinity, and all of a sudden you look at the top 8, you got Affinity destroying the tournament. Now, it's weird, right, because when you think of Affinity, you don't think of the most skill-intensive deck, but at the end of the day, you don't get more points out of the most skill-intensive deck.
I take a point with that comment.
Do you?
Affinity.
I think there are moments it can be very skill-intensive, but there are sometimes you just go, put a Cranial Plague in my Ornithopter, you're dead.
All right.
You know, so you have those draws as well. That aspect of it, I think, makes it appealing. How do you feel?
So what I think is really the big draw is that Affinity is good against the stuff that's good against the decks people are gunning for. If you expect a lot of Death Shadow and you have one-for-one removal spells, I don't care how many Fatal Pushes you have if I draw Arcbound Ravager, Cranial Plating, Etched Champion. This is really good against that. I actually played Affinity at the Team Grand Prix in San Antonio. I got paired against Eldrazi-tron 3 times. It's a bye. You cannot lose to Eldrazi-tron with Affinity. I had an opponent play turn 3 Karn, and it was just easy. You just roll that deck over. So that's really the strength of Affinity, and it's going to take the sideboard cards to push this deck back out of the format.
So I ask you, Craig, are people going to load up on sideboard cards or not for Affinity this weekend?
I think that Modern is still wide open enough that we'll see people just hedging. We'll see some of the really powerful sideboard cards coming out. I don't think people are going to go over the top to beat this deck. We've already talked about how Grixis Death Shadow is still probably the top deck in the format. Looking out for Death Shadow and looking out for Affinity are 2 very different sideboard strategies.
It's true. And another deck that requires a different sideboarding strategy, there's a little bit of overlap between Death Shadow and Dredge, but not entirely.
Yeah.
You know, you do want to go after their graveyards a little bit, but as we take a look at Dredge very quickly, you know, obviously this is a deck that we know Ross Merriam likes to play. We've seen Todd Anderson, Tom Ross, those guys play that. Ryan, I'll start with you to make our way through this because the player meeting is going to start here in just a moment. For Dredge, good choice, bad choice?
Good choice.
Okay.
It's actually the only format where I feel like Dredge sometimes gets better in the sideboard games. If your opponent mulligans aggressively to Rest in Peace, first of all, it can be too slow against your nut draw. Second of all, you get this huge upgrade in casting Trained Armadon, which doesn't sound like much, but if my opponent mulligans to a non-functional Hateful Hand, and I cast 2 mana 1/1, 3 mana 3/3, sometimes they're just going to lose.
Yeah, that's true. Matthias, for you?
You know, it's one of the decks I think that can claim a positive Shadow matchup, so I do like that about it. A little skeptical on the rest of it. It's okay.
For you? I know you've been kind of a big proponent of it.
I like this deck a lot. I think it's one of the best Game 1 decks in the format. Everyone's got to look out for all of these various creatures running around, and Dredge just does not care about your removal at all.
Very true.
Doesn't really care about your discard spells a whole lot, so it's just so well positioned in the Game 1s that it's hard to dislike a deck like that.
Now, before we do put a wrap on this here, because player meeting is about to start behind us, we don't want to talk over that for the players over here. There are obviously a million other decks. There are your Thoughtseize decks. You know, Splashing Lingering Souls, they can be black-green, they can be Jund, they can be Abzan. You know, some play Dark Confidant Tarmogoyf, some play Grimflayer. There's Abzan Traverse decks, and the deck that we saw Todd Stevens win with, Eldrazi-tron, super popular. It has some very good matchups, it has some very poor matchups, like Affinity, like you mentioned. We're going to be in a room here where, especially with the Modern portion of this tournament, where you can do what you want. As we know, because we've covered a lot of Modern here on the SCG Tour, if you know what you're doing with your deck, you can play what you want to play and be successful. That's some of the appeal. And as we do kind of a roll call here, we're going to make our predictions or who we think is going to win along with the decks we would play. You can do whatever you want in Modern. So what are you doing in Modern? What are you doing in Standard? And who do you think is going to win this tournament, Ryan?
I'm going to play some Death Shadow variant in Modern. You got to claw that card out of my hand until they ban it. It just seems that good. In Standard, I probably make a bad judgment call and play Torrential Gearhulk. That's my nature. My pick to win the tournament, I'm going to pick my best friend, Brad Carpenter. Recently joined the Metagame Gurus. That's a great team. Recently won the Louisville Modern Classic. Really great player with a great resume and really set up to win the tournament.
Matthias, I'm coming to you.
All right, so for Modern, I want to play Death Shadow. I want to be a little retro with it, though. I want to play Jund Death Shadow. I care enough about Affinity that I'm going to switch a color. In Standard, I really like Mardu right now. It's powerful. I'd probably play that. Pick for the tournament, I think Standard's open enough that I want a player who's kind of a single deck guy, who's got a lot of reps in with his deck, but I want someone who also has the play skill. I'm going to go with Brennan DeCandio for this tournament.
I think that's a pretty good choice. Craig, I'm coming to you.
Okay, so I think I want to be playing Dredge right now. I think there's still enough noise in the Modern format that people just don't have enough hate for this deck. So I think it still has a big edge, and I want to be playing that. Standard, I would probably show up with a black-green Delirium style deck. I would have it be fairly aggressive with a lot of Planeswalkers probably, and just try to take advantage of the format that way. My pick, I gotta go with Brad Nelson.
Okay.
I think he's just too good to pick against. Like,
right now he is.
Like you give me anyone in the room and he's standing there, like how can you pass over him to pick someone else?
It's very difficult. I'm about to do that, but it's tough.
Sure.
It's tough. Modern, I would play Fairies again. Look, you can do whatever you want, and I think I'm taking the same approach I was taking to Vegas, which was best people in the room are going to play Death Shadow.
Yep.
I have to beat Death Shadow, and my matchup there is pretty good. Now, Affinity matchup, not good at all.
We're still playing Go for the Throat?
I might change a couple numbers.
All right.
I might change a couple numbers. All right, maybe I'll play Ultimate Price instead. I don't know. I might change a couple numbers, but still
that's only marginally better than the matchup.
I know. I might change a couple of things there, but I was 10-2 in Vegas before I lost to Affinity twice, and then a Death Shadow deck. So at the tournament, I didn't have anything for Affinity, so I got creamed. But I kind of expect that if I got paired against them. For Standard, I would play Mardu Vehicles because I love 75 card decks. And that is the hallmark of a 75 card deck, just like Jund in years past. You know, you get the best sideboard, and I love having the best sideboard when it's best 2 out of 3. And if I make the top 8, best 3 out of 5. And then last, but certainly not least, he's been hiding for a little bit. That's Jerry Thompson.
Okay.
He won the Pro Tour.
Pro Tour winners.
Yeah, Pro Tour champion.
All right.
Quietly
That's
won
under
the Pro
radar.
Tour. Pro Tour champion, 2-time Invitational champion. I think 6 Invitational top 8s. But post Pro Tour, he hasn't really been. Post Pro Tour, he hasn't really been anything.
It's the dark horse pick.
Yeah.
Way to find the sleeper out there.
Thank you very much. Post Pro Tour, like he went to Vegas, didn't have a good tournament or anything. Didn't go to Grand Prix Cleveland because Josh Cho and Raptor are already like good to go for the season.
Yep.
And they normally do well in those tournaments anyway. But he hasn't really been like at tournaments much. And he said like he wanted to come to this because he wanted to play Death Shadow in Modern before it got banned because he has a feeling it's going to get banned. I think a lot of people do. And that deck's great.
Yeah.
And if he wants to go back to zombies, he knows the deck better than anybody. He won the Pro Tour with it. So give me Jerry T. A real tough pick here in the booth for me. Jared Silva, our director of organized play, is making his announcements, so we are going to get out of here. So for Ryan Oversheriff, Matthias on Greg Krempel, I'm Cedric Phillips. We take a short break. We'll have round number 1 of coverage for you guys, 12:30 Eastern. Until then, enjoy some best of SCG Tour and some other things, and then we'll start round number 1.